Welcome to another edition of Mailbag. And right up front, if you're sitting there thinking, I watched that video the other day, the reason is because I'm recording one block header for all the Mailbag items I'm going to be filming this afternoon. I was filming outside in the workshop, but it's got too cold, so I've moved inside to the orange corner. So here we go. Now remember, Mailbag are questions, comments, and various other things that you guys leave on the channel or you email me directly that I think are worth airing. So before we get going, parish notices. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, why not? Tell your friends, tell the street, tell the world, get them to subscribe. I jest. But if you seriously haven't subscribed to the channel and you like videos about this sort of stuff and musical equipment in general, then subscribe. If you want to be notified when those sort of videos hit the channel, you really need to press that bell icon as well. If you like the content of the video, give it a thumbs up. Down below, leave comments. I do read the comments, I respond to the comments, and sometimes I even make videos about the comments you guys leave, so they give me ideas about future content for the channel. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you can support the channel and support the production of videos. The address of the TMTG community is down the bottom there, as are the Facebook and Instagram feeds, where all the channel notices during the week are posted, and obviously the release of videos is posted over there as well. But now, back to the next mailbag item. The next one comes from Fuzz Bulby. Great name, by the way. And it's in response to how to set up the sync function on the Roland MX-1, which is a video I did a long time ago. And he writes, I set Ableton to receive the clock from the MX-1, but since the PC has latency, can you use Ableton latency to compensate when receiving external clock signal? I guess it would be better to use it the other way around, to send clock from the PC to the MX-1. Ooh. Yes. I keep threatening to do a video on the whole sort of MIDI clock thing in general, and this one really hits the nail on the head in terms of MIDI clock and networks. In simple terms, you can only have one MIDI clock in your MIDI network. Okay, it doesn't matter where that clock is. Well, it does actually, but you can only have one MIDI clock, or one master clock, should I say. And in the good old days, you went to a studio, you'd have a central clock to which all your computer equipment would be time coded to. And I can't get that out easily, but I'm looking at the back of the Akai sequencer that is in this case here, and it's got a BNC connector, and that would be connected into the studio clock. And it's much the same as when you're doing videos and you have an SN, you have a time code against the videos. I mean, I don't tend to use that because I'm not, my video equipment's not that flash, but if you get up to sort of doing more professional work, there will be one time code and all the video and sound will all be synced to that one time code. It makes it much easier when you put it together, honestly. And maybe that's the next step for my channel, but right where we are, I don't do that. I use a simple mechanism for aligning the sound on multiple videos. Anyway, off the subject, let's get back to where we are. This was kind of a parallel arrangement in the old studios. So you had one time code, and then it effectively ran a BNC cable. And you're all going to say, what's a BNC cable if you haven't seen one? And I haven't got one to show me, but effectively it's like a, if you imagine the old aerial cable that used to run into the back of your TV, is very, very similar in concept to that sort of central copper core with a braided outside, which was the earth. Anyway, you'd have that sort of thing, and that would basically run around all your key studio systems, from the clock, and that would effectively keep everything in sync. So it'll go from the desk to the tape deck. And you know, back in the day when I was doing 8-track and stuff like that, quite often we'd have an SMTP, a SMT timecode being generated somewhere that would keep things in sequence. And that's how it did. That's how it worked. You had an SMTP converter. No, SMTP is mail protocol. Sorry, I'm getting my acronyms. But you have a SMT converter to MIDI that would then run somewhere in the network that would then effectively become the MIDI clock. I digress. Anyway, MIDI. If you're running things MIDI has a hierarchical way of working, which basically means that you have to have a time code at the top of the chain somewhere, or a clock at the top of the chain somewhere, and that clock needs to filter down to all the instruments on the MIDI chain. And if you, depending on what instrument you have and how good they were at dealing with the MIDI 1.0 standard, theoretically, as long as you went in through on your instruments as you went down your daisy chain, then you would have a single clock, and everything in your MIDI studio would talk the same language. Now, this is kind of where you need to plan your implementation now, and it's not one size fits all, guys. So, you know, forgive me. I'm going to describe something which is kind of a utopia, and then you need to then think about how you're going to adapt this. So, under normal circumstances, if you're recording with the DAW, that kind of needs to be at the head of the daisy chain. Okay? It needs to be the clock at the top. Now, the problem with doing that is that means every time you want to change the time signature, speed, the BPMs, the time. Don't mean time signature. I'm not talking about 4/4 or 7/8 or whatever it happens to be. I'm talking about how many beats per minute that the song you are writing is running to. Let's try that. You have to change it in Ableton, and it then cascades down. You can't quickly change the knob in the MX-1. So if you change tempo, you change it on the head device, and it ripples down, and everything that is connected to it, as long as you've got your MIDI chaining right, will also speed up and slow down in time with what you set Ableton up to do. You may decide that you want to start with a different clock source. So you might want a drum machine, or you might want the MX-1, or you might want something else that effectively is your clock. You can still buy dedicated clocks. I haven't seen one for a long while, but I am assured by somebody you can still buy these things. The problem you have now is, back in the good old days, everything was connected MIDI. There was no such thing as USB. And unfortunately, USB confuses the implementation. So in a traditional 5-pin MIDI implementation, MIDI flows from the out to the in, or from the through to the in. Okay, it's one directional, right? And that's why you end up with 3 sockets on the back of this stuff, right? One's for in, one's for out. It cannot handle bi-directional information on the same cable. Any note generated by a device that is, if you have an in and you start playing notes on that, they won't be replicated on the throw. You have to take an out feed and put a merge box in the stream somewhere if you want to continue transmitting MIDI data to the next box in the line, if you like. You can't connect an out to an in of a higher device up the daisy chain, because what then happens is you then end up with a circular MIDI stream. So note data is being switched on and off, or data is being conflicted. So it was very linear in the way you planned your studio. That's probably what I'm trying to say. USB comes along, and USB allows you to do bi-directional MIDI. And that's where the problem becomes a bit interesting, and it's not really supported by the MIDI 1.0 standard. So MIDI 1.0 was developed and signed off in, what, 1984? Don't kill me for getting the date wrong, guys, but it was around that area. And we've only just signed off MIDI standard 2.0. So we've been running effectively on MIDI standard 1.0 since the early 80s. And in that time, what we do with our instruments and our computers and other studio equipment has changed quite a lot. And the problem is that MIDI 1.0 doesn't really handle this kind of bidirectional. Your implementation, you still need to put the clock at the head of the daisy chain. It doesn't matter whether you're using a traditional 5-pin DIN or a USB connection, you still need to have your clock at the head of the daisy chain. And all other devices that need the clock need to be set as slaves. This is really important. Okay? In the MIDI standard, clock is channel independent, but clock will only be transmitted or only be recognized by the instruments as long as they feel that the clock is a slave to a clock signal that's being received. Now, a lot of instruments, especially a lot of instruments that have been built over the last 10 plus years, okay, have an auto recognize feature, and that can really screw you up. Okay, and the reason it can really screw you up is because it might auto recognize that there's no clock signal and therefore just defaults to the internal, and you come along and you think you're doing something, you don't realize that it's not picking up the external clock source. So don't set the clock to auto. If you're going to use an external source, set your instrument as a slave to an external clock. That's the first thing. And it can also lead to all kinds of weird and wonderful things happening. If the MX-1 thinks it's the master clock and Ableton thinks it's the master clock, they will try to compete with each other. So that's that one. If you're able to put the MX-1 at the head of the chain, then that's fine. But bear in mind, if you're then sending MIDI signals back to the MX-1, you kind of need to be careful, because effectively what you're saying is the MX-1 is the top, your door's over here, and your instruments are over here. Or your door's over here and your instruments are coming off your computer. So one of the things I do, and this is why I'm going to do this as a video, is draw your implementation out on a piece of paper. Work it out. Work out what needs to be the head, how the data, and that's the note data, the control change data, the clock data, how it needs to flow around your MIDI implementation. And then don't make changes on the fly, because that really screws you up as well. So why is this a big long ramble? And it is a kind of a ramble because it's just not straightforward. To me, it's very straightforward because I've been doing it for years, but it's not straightforward. And you're right, you cannot use items like things like the start-stop button. Yeah, because unless you're sending the control data from the device with the start-stop button to the next device in the chain, and control data is channel specific in a lot of instances. So unless you're doing that, you can't really have the DAW driving the MX-1. Yeah, you can do clever things like using merge units to take an out and combine it with a throw so that the signal carries on down. But as I said, I think the most important thing about this sort of whole area is the MIDI chain. The MX-1 confuses things because the mixer can operate as a slave or or a master, or as a surface to Ableton. And I've said on the channel before, I do not use my MX-1 in that mode. I cannot work with the MX-1 being a surface for Ableton. It just doesn't work for me, guys. So I gave up on that a long time ago. I tend to use my MX-1 in a mode called external, and I tend to have it as a slave in terms of clock signal to Ableton when I'm recording. So that's kind of how I set it up. So Ableton is generating the signal, and the reason why, guys, you're seeing latency is because, and depending on what computer platform you're working on, you're sending your clock signal up to the computer to be processed and then sent back from the computer to the MX-1. That's where the latency, half of the latency, is coming in. Just don't do it.